Sometimes survival asks a question that morality can't answer. And on the coldest night of my life, I learned that one desperate choice can change everything. The city looked beautiful from a distance. Towers of glass reflected the winter lights, luxury cars glided through the streets, and people hurried along sidewalks carrying shopping bags filled with things they probably didn't need. But beauty felt different when you were standing outside a hospital with less than $20 in your wallet and a family member running out of time. My name is Noah Reed, and 3 years ago, I believed hard work could solve almost any problem. I believed if I worked enough hours, paid enough bills, and sacrificed enough sleep, things would eventually get better. I was wrong. Life didn't care how hard I tried. It didn't care that I worked double shifts at a diner 6 days a week. It didn't care that I skipped meals so my younger brother could have enough. It certainly didn't care that I was exhausted. The hospital's automatic doors opened behind me, letting out a rush of warm air before closing again. I stared at the folded invoice in my hand. The numbers printed across the page felt impossible. The specialist said my brother Ethan needed immediate treatment. Without it, his condition would continue getting worse. The hospital had given me until sunrise to secure a payment arrangement. Sunrise. Less than 8 hours away. I laughed quietly, though there was nothing funny about it. 8 hours might as well have been 8 minutes. I had already borrowed money from everyone I knew. Friends stopped answering my calls weeks ago. Credit cards were maxed out. My savings account contained exactly $12.37. I knew because I checked 3 times. Through the 4th-floor hospital window, I could see my brother's silhouette sitting beside the bed. At 16, he should have been worrying about school, sports, and college applications. Instead, he spent his nights attached to medical equipment while pretending not to notice how scared I was. Ethan always smiled when I entered the room. He thought it made things easier for me. Maybe it did. Maybe that was why seeing him smile hurt so much. Snow drifted lazily from the dark sky as I walked away from the hospital. The city seemed quieter after midnight. Streetlights cast golden reflections across wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted from an upscale restaurant. Expensive laughter followed. People inside those buildings lived in a different universe. One where emergencies could be solved with a phone call. One where bills didn't determine whether someone got another chance. I shoved my hands into my jacket pockets and kept walking. No destination. No plan. Just movement. Because standing still meant thinking. And thinking meant panic. Then I saw it. A black luxury sedan parked beside the curb outside a private club. Even I recognized the brand. The kind of vehicle that cost more than most houses. As a sharply dressed man stepped from the entrance, the city lights caught something on his wrist. A watch. Silver. Elegant. The kind collectors paid fortunes to own. My heart stopped. Then it started racing. I stared at that watch longer than I should have. One decision. One terrible decision. Maybe enough to save my brother. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped forward into the falling snow. The moment my fingers closed around the watch, every sound around me seemed to disappear. The laughter from the club faded. The traffic noise vanished. Even the falling snow felt silent. For one impossible second, I thought I had succeeded. Then a calm voice behind me shattered the illusion. That belongs to me. My entire body froze. I had imagined 100 different outcomes during the last few desperate minutes. Maybe I would escape. Maybe security would stop me. Maybe someone would call the police. What I had not imagined was a voice that sounded completely unconcerned. No anger. No shouting. Just certainty. Slowly, I turned around. The man standing in front of me was taller than I had realized. Dark hair. Sharp features. A perfectly tailored black coat dusted with snowflakes. His expression was unreadable. Around him, the night itself seemed to pause. I can explain. I blurted out immediately. It was a terrible lie. I had no explanation that would make any sense. The silver watch was still in my hand. Evidence did not get much clearer than that. His gaze dropped briefly to the watch before returning to my face. "Can you?" he asked. Before I could answer, several men appeared from nowhere. 1 second the sidewalk had been empty. The next, 4 imposing figures stood nearby. Their attention was fixed entirely on me. The realization hit like ice water. These were not bodyguards hired by a wealthy businessman. Their movements were too coordinated, too disciplined. Something about them made every instinct in my body whisper a warning. Run. Unfortunately, my legs refused to cooperate. One of the men stepped forward. "Sir, Should we handle this? The man in the black coat never looked away from me. No, a single word. Quiet. Absolute. The others immediately stepped back. That frightened me more than anything else. People only obeyed like that when the person giving orders possessed extraordinary authority. Snow continued drifting through the glow of the streetlights. My grip loosened on the watch. I am sorry, I said honestly this time. I know that does not fix anything. For the first time, something flickered across his face. Not anger. Curiosity. You are not very good at this. Heat rushed into my cheeks despite the freezing temperature. It was my first attempt. The admission escaped before I could stop it. To my surprise, one corner of his mouth twitched upward. Not quite a smile. More like disbelief. Your first attempt at theft? Yes. And you chose me? I swallowed hard. I did not know who you were. A strange silence followed. The men behind him exchanged brief glances. The reaction made my stomach tighten. Whoever this person was, apparently everyone else knew exactly who he was. Everyone except me. Finally, he extended his hand toward the watch. I returned it immediately. Our fingers brushed for only a moment. What is your name? He asked. Noah Reed. Noah Reed. He repeated it as though committing it to memory. Then a black luxury vehicle pulled to the curb beside us. The rear door opened automatically. One of the men leaned toward him and spoke quietly. I caught only 3 words. Mafia. King. Moretti. My blood turned cold. Vincent Moretti. Even I knew that name. Every newspaper in the city knew that name. And standing less than 3 feet away from me was the man I had just tried to rob. For several seconds, I could not breathe. Every headline I had ever seen flashed through my mind. Vincent Moretti was one of those names that existed above ordinary life, the kind whispered in conversations and printed in business magazines. Some people called him a financial genius. Others called him the most influential man in the city. No matter which version was true, one fact remained unchanged. I had just attempted to steal from him. I waited for disaster. It seemed inevitable. Instead, Vincent glanced toward the open car door and then back at me. His expression remained unreadable. You look disappointed, he said. I blinked. Disappointed? Most people react differently when they learn who I am. I think I am still processing it. To my horror, that answer appeared to amuse him. One of the men standing nearby cleared his throat. Sir, we should leave. The meeting starts in 20 minutes. Vincent ignored him. His attention remained fixed on me. You said this was your first attempt. I nodded cautiously. Why tonight? The question should have been simple. Instead, it felt impossible. Pride told me to stay silent. Exhaustion told me otherwise. Maybe I was too tired to lie anymore. Maybe I simply could not carry the weight by myself another minute. My brother is in the hospital, I admitted. The treatment he needs is expensive. They gave me until sunrise to find a way to pay. The cold air seemed to grow even quieter. Vincent studied my face as though measuring every word. And you believed stealing a watch would solve that problem? No, I laughed weakly. I believed it was the only option I had left. The honesty surprised even me. For a moment, nobody spoke. Snow continued drifting through the city lights while traffic rolled steadily past the curb. The world moved on, completely unaware that my future might be decided on this sidewalk. Finally, Vincent turned toward one of his associates. What hospital? The man looked confused. Sir, Vincent did not raise his voice. He simply repeated the question. Which hospital serves this district? St. Gabriel Medical Center. My stomach tightened. That was Ethan's hospital. Vincent looked back at me. How old is your brother? 16. And your parents? I lowered my eyes. Gone. Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle enough that I almost missed it. Not sympathy. Not pity. Recognition. As if something in my answer had connected to a memory he rarely visited. One of the associates checked his watch. Sir, the board members are waiting. Vincent finally nodded. The conversation seemed over. Relief and disappointment collided inside me. Of course it was over. Men like Vincent Moretti did not spend their evenings helping strangers who made terrible decisions. He stepped toward the vehicle. Then he stopped. Noah. Hearing my name from him felt strangely unsettling. Yes. Be at St. Gabriel tomorrow at 9 in the morning. My heart skipped. Why? Vincent opened the car door and paused before answering. Because I would like to verify whether you are telling the truth. Before I could ask another question, he entered the vehicle. The door closed. Seconds later, the black car disappeared into the snowy night. leaving me alone on the sidewalk with one impossible thought repeating inside my head. Vincent Moretti had not forgiven me. He had not punished me either. Somehow, that uncertainty felt far more dangerous. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the black luxury car disappearing into the snow. By 6 in the morning, I was sitting beside Ethan's hospital bed pretending everything was normal. He was flipping through channels on the television while a paper cup of untouched apple juice rested on the tray beside him. "You look terrible," he said with a grin. "Thanks. Seriously, Noah, did you sleep at all?" I forced a smile. A little. He knew I was lying. Ethan had always been able to read me better than anyone else. Fortunately, he did not push. Instead, he launched into a story about a nurse who had accidentally called him by another patient's name 3 times in a row. I laughed in all the right places, but my attention kept drifting toward the clock mounted on the wall. 8:30, 8:45, 8:52. By 8:58, my stomach felt tied in knots. Vincent Moretti was not coming. The idea had been ridiculous from the beginning. Men like him did not rearrange their schedules because of conversations with strangers. I was already preparing myself for disappointment when movement outside the hospital room caught my eye. 2 men in dark suits appeared in the hallway. They were followed by a third, then a fourth. Every nurse nearby suddenly seemed unusually alert. The atmosphere shifted. Even Ethan noticed. "What is going on?" he asked. Before I could answer, Vincent stepped into view. The room instantly felt smaller. He was dressed in a charcoal overcoat and carried himself with the same effortless confidence I remembered from the night before. Several hospital administrators hurried behind him, looking nervous and eager at the same time. Vincent ignored all of them. His attention landed directly on me. "Good morning, Noah." I stood so quickly that my chair nearly tipped over. "You actually came." One of his eyebrows lifted slightly. "You sound surprised." "I am surprised." To my astonishment, Ethan started laughing. "Noah, are you going to introduce your friend?" Friend was definitely not the correct word, but Vincent extended a hand toward my brother. "Vincent Moretti." Ethan's eyes widened immediately. Unlike me, he recognized the name without hesitation. "The Vincent Moretti? I suspect there is only one." Ethan looked at me as though I had forgotten to mention I knew a celebrity. I wished the explanation were that simple. Vincent spent several minutes speaking with him. Not out of obligation. Not because anyone expected it. He genuinely listened as Ethan described school, basketball, and his plans for the future. Watching them felt surreal. This was not the distant, intimidating figure from newspaper articles. This was someone paying close attention to details most people overlooked. Eventually, Vincent stepped into the hallway with the lead physician. Their conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When the doctor returned, his expression looked completely different. Hopeful, relieved, almost excited. "Noah," he said carefully, "it appears your brother's treatment has been approved. We can begin immediately." My mind went blank. "Approved?" The doctor nodded. "All financial concerns have been resolved." I slowly turned toward Vincent. He met my stunned gaze without saying a word. For the second time in less than 12 hours, my entire future shifted beneath my feet. For several long seconds, I simply stared at him. The doctor continued explaining treatment schedules, paperwork, and recovery expectations, but the words blurred together. All I could focus on was the impossible reality standing a few feet away. The financial burden that had crushed me for months had disappeared in a single morning. When the physician finally left the room, I followed Vincent into the hallway. "Why?" The question escaped before I could stop it. He glanced toward a nearby window overlooking the city. "Why what? Why help us?" His expression remained calm. "Because your story was true." I almost laughed. There are thousands of true stories in this city. I am aware. Then why mine? For the first time, he seemed to consider the question seriously. "Perhaps because you were willing to make a terrible choice for someone other than yourself." That answer only confused me more. Before I could respond, one of his associates approached carrying a tablet. The man paused when he noticed me standing there. "Sir, the board meeting has been moved to 11. Vincent nodded. "Good." The associate lowered his voice. "There is also the matter we discussed this morning." A brief silence followed. Something passed between them that I could not interpret. Vincent dismissed him with a glance and turned back to me. "Noah, how long have you been caring for your brother alone?" "Almost 6 years. And during that time?" I shrugged. "I worked, paid bills, Tried not to make mistakes. Tried. I smiled weakly. Last night suggests I was not entirely successful. To my surprise, that earned the faintest hint of amusement. Then his expression became serious again. Come with me. My heart skipped. Where? Lunch. I blinked. Lunch. You have been awake all night. You have not eaten properly. And there are things I would like to discuss. Every instinct told me this was a terrible idea. People from my world did not casually have lunch with Vincent Moretti. We certainly did not climb into luxury vehicles waiting outside hospitals. Yet nothing about the past 12 hours had followed logic. 20 minutes later, I found myself sitting inside a private dining room overlooking the river. The restaurant was unlike anywhere I had ever visited. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, while sunlight reflected across the water below. I felt completely out of place. Vincent, meanwhile, appeared perfectly comfortable, as though every room automatically belonged to him. A server delivered coffee and lunch before disappearing almost immediately. Relax, Vincent said. You look like you are expecting an examination. I feel like I am in one. His gaze sharpened slightly. Good observation. I set down my coffee cup. So this is not just lunch. No, he leaned back in his chair. Last night, I learned that Noah Reed is loyal, desperate, and willing to take risks. Today, I learned he tells the truth. My pulse quickened. What does that mean? Vincent looked directly at me. It means I have an offer for you. The offer hung between us like a suspended bridge, impossible to cross until one of us moved first. I stared at Vincent, trying to determine whether this was a business discussion or the beginning of something far more complicated. What kind of offer? I finally asked. Vincent folded his hands on the table. A temporary arrangement. That answer immediately raised more questions than it answered. Temporary sounds vague. 90 days, he said. Exactly 90 days. I leaned back in my chair. And what happens during those 90 days? You work for me. I almost laughed. You cannot be serious. I rarely joke during business conversations. The problem was that he looked completely serious. I glanced around the elegant dining room as if someone else might explain what was happening. Nobody did. I do not have any special skills, I said. I worked in restaurants, warehouses, and delivery services. That is not exactly the resume people like you are looking for. I disagree. Vincent took a sip of coffee. Skills can be taught. Character is more difficult to find. I was beginning to understand why so many people found him intimidating. He spoke calmly, but every sentence sounded final. Why me? I asked again. Because everyone around me wants something. His answer arrived instantly, as though he had considered it many times before. Money, influence, opportunities, favors. Most people begin calculating the moment they enter a room. His gaze shifted toward the river beyond the windows. You are the first person I have met in a long time who was too busy worrying about someone else to care who I was. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. For a brief moment, I saw something beneath the confidence and authority. Not weakness, loneliness. It disappeared so quickly I wondered if I had imagined it. What exactly would I be doing? I asked. Assisting several charitable projects my company supports. That surprised me. Charitable projects? Hospitals, youth programs, community centers. My confusion must have shown because Vincent almost smiled. You expected something else. Honestly, yes. Most people do. Lunch continued for nearly an hour. The more we talked, the stranger everything became. Vincent knew details about hospital funding, scholarship programs, and neighborhood outreach centers. None of those topics matched the public image I had seen in newspapers. Eventually, he slid a folder across the table. Inside was a formal agreement outlining the 90-day position. The salary listed near the bottom made my eyes widen. It was more money than I earned in several months. This cannot be real. It is real. And all I have to do is help with these projects. Among other responsibilities. Something about that phrase made me pause. Among other responsibilities? Vincent stood, signaling the end of lunch. You will learn more soon enough. Before I could ask another question, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. For the first time all day, his expression hardened. The warmth vanished. The room seemed colder. Is something wrong? I asked. Vincent slipped the phone into his pocket. Not yet. The answer should have reassured me. Instead, it made me uneasy. Then he looked directly at me and said 5 words that changed everything once again. Noah, do not go home. The warning followed me all the way back to the hospital. Do not go home. Vincent had delivered those words so calmly that nobody else would have noticed anything unusual. I noticed. By the time I reached Ethan's room, the uneasy feeling in my chest had only grown stronger. Ethan was resting after a series of tests, so I stepped into the hallway and called my landlord. The call went straight to voicemail. That was unusual. I tried again. Nothing. Then I called my neighbor, Mrs. Dawson, the retired teacher who lived across the hall from our apartment. She answered on the second ring. Noah. Her voice sounded nervous. Mrs. Dawson, is everything okay? A brief silence followed. Where are you? At the hospital. Good. The single word immediately set off alarms in my head. What happened? Another pause. There were people asking about you this morning. My grip tightened around the phone. What kind of people? I do not know. They were polite, but they were asking questions. They wanted to know when you usually came home, whether you lived alone, things like that. My pulse quickened. Did you tell them anything? Of course not. Relief washed through me. Thank you. Noah, she said quietly. Who are these people? I wished I knew. After ending the call, I stood motionless beside the hospital window. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass, yet suddenly nowhere felt safe. 24 hours ago, my biggest concern had been money. Now strangers were apparently searching for me. My phone vibrated. A text message appeared from an unknown number. Look outside. I immediately froze. Slowly, I glanced through the window toward the hospital parking lot 4 stories below. A black sedan sat near the entrance. Standing beside it was one of Vincent's associates. Even from this distance, I recognized him. Seconds later, another message arrived. Mr. Moretti would like you to relocate temporarily. The word relocate did not exactly sound optional. 10 minutes later, I found myself inside the same black vehicle. The associate introduced himself as Adrian. Unlike most of Vincent's employees, he seemed surprisingly approachable. Am I in danger? I asked as the city passed outside the tinted windows. Adrian considered the question carefully. Not currently. That is not very comforting. It is the truth. I sighed. Can someone at least explain what is happening? Adrian looked toward the driver before answering. There are people who pay attention when Mr. Moretti takes an interest in someone. An interest? You had lunch with him, visited a hospital with him, traveled with him. He shrugged. In certain circles, that attracts attention. I stared out the window. The explanation somehow made everything worse. Nearly 40 minutes later, the car entered a private gated property overlooking the river. The residence beyond the gates looked less like a house and more like a luxury resort. Glass walls reflected the afternoon sunlight, while manicured gardens stretched across several acres. My mouth actually fell open. Adrian almost smiled. Welcome to Moretti House. I stepped out of the vehicle and looked around in disbelief. This place belonged in magazines, not reality. Then the front doors opened. Vincent appeared at the top of the stone staircase, watching my reaction with unmistakable amusement. You are late, he called. I stared at him. You moved me into a mansion. Temporarily. That is your defense. For the first time since meeting him, Vincent laughed openly. And somehow, that unexpected sound made me even more nervous than before. The house was even more unbelievable from the inside. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the river, sunlight reflected off polished stone floors, and every room seemed larger than my entire apartment building. A woman named Clara showed me to a guest suite on the second floor. Guest suite was a generous understatement. The bedroom alone was bigger than any place I had ever lived. After she left, I stood in the middle of the room staring at the city beyond the glass. 24 hours ago, I had been calculating how many days remained before eviction. Now I was standing inside one of the most expensive homes in the state. None of it felt real. A knock sounded at the door later that evening. Vincent entered carrying 2 folders. Settling in? He asked. I think I am still in shock. That is understandable. He handed me one of the folders. Inside were reports about scholarship programs, hospital donations, and youth centers. Page after page described projects funded through organizations connected to his company. These are the projects you mentioned? I asked. Vincent nodded. Most of my time is spent dealing with numbers. I need someone who remembers the people behind those numbers. I flipped through several pages. One photograph caught my attention. A community center built in a struggling neighborhood. Another showed a pediatric wing in a hospital. You paid for these? Partially. Nobody talks about this. Vincent looked toward the window. That is because I do not pay people to talk about it. The answer stayed with me long after he left. During the next several days, I began accompanying him to meetings and site visits. The experience shattered nearly every assumption I had made about him. At a children's hospital, he spent nearly an hour speaking with families nobody else seemed to notice. At a scholarship event, he remembered students by name. At a community center, staff members greeted him with genuine affection rather than obligation. The public version of Vincent Moretti and the man I was meeting every day seemed like completely different people. Yet one mystery continued bothering me. Despite being surrounded by employees, advisors, and executives, Vincent often appeared alone. Late one evening, I found him sitting in a library overlooking the river. A single lamp illuminated the room. Several untouched documents rested on the table beside him. "You should be sleeping," I said. He glanced up. "So should you." I stepped closer. "Do you ever stop working?" "Rarely." "Why?" For a moment, he seemed surprised by the question. Then he looked out toward the dark water beyond the glass. "Because when I stop moving, I start remembering." The quiet honesty of that answer caught me completely off guard. Before I could respond, his phone rang. The expression on his face changed immediately. Not fear, not anger, concern. He listened silently for several seconds. Then he stood. "What happened?" I asked. Vincent ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. "Someone has been asking questions about your family." Every trace of warmth vanished from my body. "What kind of questions?" His jaw tightened. "The kind that suggests this situation is becoming more complicated than I anticipated." The next morning began with tension hanging over the entire house. Nobody said much during breakfast. Even the staff seemed unusually quiet. Vincent spent most of the morning on calls while I accompanied Ethan to another treatment session. The good news was impossible to ignore. His doctors were optimistic. For the first time in years, my brother was talking about the future instead of simply trying to get through the week. That should have been enough to make me happy. Instead, Vincent's warning continued echoing in my mind. By late afternoon, I finally found him standing on a terrace overlooking the river. The wind tugged gently at his coat as he stared across the water. "Any updates?" I asked. He glanced toward me. "A few. Are you going to tell me?" A faint smile appeared. "You have become surprisingly direct. Living in your house has apparently changed me." The smile lingered for a moment before fading. "The people asking questions are connected to an old financial investigation." I frowned. "What does that have to do with me?" "That is what I wanted to understand." Vincent handed me a thin folder. Inside were copies of business records, legal documents, and photographs. One image immediately caught my attention. My uncle. I stared at the picture in disbelief. "What is this?" The answer to several questions. My hands tightened around the folder. My uncle had disappeared years ago after convincing my parents to invest in a business venture that eventually collapsed. The loss had devastated our family financially. We never learned exactly what happened. Vincent looked toward the river again. "Your parents were not ruined by bad luck." The words landed like a physical weight. "What are you saying?" "Someone manipulated the situation." I looked down at the documents. Dates, transactions, signatures, patterns I had never known existed. "My uncle." Vincent nodded once. "The evidence suggests he profited significantly." For several seconds I could not speak. Every memory I had carried for years suddenly felt uncertain. The resentment, the confusion, the belief that life had simply been unfair. None of it matched the truth sitting in my hands. "Why would he do that?" I whispered. "Greed convinces people to make strange choices." Silence settled between us. Eventually, I closed the folder and looked up. "How did you find all this?" Vincent met my gaze. "Because once your name became attached to mine, I wanted to know who might try to use that connection." The answer should have sounded practical. Instead, it felt personal. Before I could respond, my phone rang. It was Ethan. I answered immediately. His voice burst through the speaker, excited and breathless. "Noah, you need to get down here." "What happened?" "The doctor just told me something incredible." I felt hope spark inside my chest. For the first time in months, it was not fragile hope. It was real. As I turned toward the house, Vincent stepped beside me. Neither of us spoke. We simply started walking together toward the future that suddenly seemed brighter than either of us had expected.